The cabin stood for 3 weeks before the first rain exposed the problem. Water dripped through the roof in 6 places, pooling on the dirt floor and soaking into the lower logs. The builder had done what seemed obvious: laid bark over poles, covered it with dirt, and called it finished. By the second winter, the ridgepole had started to sag. By the third year, the entire structure would need rebuilding. This scene repeated itself across the American frontier throughout the 1830s. Settlers arriving from England, Ireland, and the eastern states brought enthusiasm and determination, but they lacked one critical element. They'd never built with logs before. Their heritage was stone, brick, and timber framing, and the gap between what they thought they knew and what the wilderness demanded was killing their cabins within 5 years. But scattered throughout the Rocky Mountains and Pacific Northwest, another type of structure was going up. Cabins that wouldn't leak, roofs that would shed snow without collapsing, structures that would still be standing in the 1900s, then the 2000s, weathering over a century and a half of mountain winters. The builders weren't doing anything magical. They were applying techniques refined over thousands of years in the forests of Scandinavia, techniques that understood one simple truth: water is the enemy, and everything else is just details. This is the story of how that knowledge spread across the frontier, of the specific techniques that separated success from failure, and of why some cabins rotted within seasons while others lasted centuries. Because in the end, the difference wasn't luck. It was precision and the willingness to do things right the first time, even when they seemed excessive. The problem started with bark. Every inexperienced builder made the same mistake. They felled trees, trimmed them, dragged them to the building site, and started stacking. The bark stayed on because removing it took time and seemed unnecessary. Back east, barns and temporary structures often used bark on logs without immediate problems. But the frontier wasn't the East. At elevation in the Rockies, temperature swings were extreme. Summer days could reach 90 degrees. Winter nights dropped to 10 below zero, or colder. The freeze-thaw cycle was relentless, and bark trapped moisture against the wood surface through every cycle, creating the perfect environment for decay fungi. Within 18 months, logs with bark still attached showed soft spots. Wood-boring beetles found the sapwood beneath the bark irresistible. Carpenter ants followed. By year 3, structural integrity was compromised. Historical documentation is unequivocal on this point. Every guide to frontier construction emphasized bark removal. One 1850s manual stated plainly, it was best to remove bark because it held moisture and invited rotting and insects. Examination of surviving 18th and 19th century cabins confirmed this. The structures still standing after 150 years had one thing in common: all bark and sapwood had been removed, leaving only dense heartwood. The Finnish and Swedish trappers working the northern territories knew this instinctively. Their ancestors had lived in timber for millennia. Log construction in Scandinavia dated back thousands of years, refined through countless generations of experience with softwood forests. When these builders arrived in America starting in 1638, they brought that accumulated knowledge. And when they built a cabin, the first step was always the same: complete bark removal. The technique required timing. Bark peeled cleanly only during late spring and early summer when sap ran strongly. A vertical cut between branches allowed the outer bark to separate from the inner bast layer. Workers peeled entire sections, exposing clean wood underneath. They worked methodically, ensuring no pockets remained where moisture could collect. The extra days spent on this task would add decades to the structure's life. But bark removal was only the first principle. The second was pitch. Roof pitch. And this is where the knowledge gap between experienced and inexperienced builders became most visible. Settlers from the eastern states built roofs like they'd seen back home. Shallow pitches, 20 to 30 degrees, that saved materials and seemed adequate. These men had built barns in Pennsylvania, houses in Virginia, sheds in Ohio. They understood construction, or so they believed. What they didn't understand was water behavior on different materials. Eastern structures used cut shingles or clapboards that shed water efficiently, even on moderate pitches. Frontier cabins, especially in the early years, used whatever materials were immediately available: bark, sod, rough split shakes. These materials didn't shed water the same way. They absorbed it, and on shallow pitches, that absorbed water sat in place, saturating the roof structure. The historical record emphasizes this point repeatedly. The steeper the gables, the drier your roof, and the longer it will last, because the water will run off quickly, and your shingled, sod, barked, or thatched roof won't retain moisture, which will help prevent it from collapsing. Experienced builders designed for steep pitch from the start. 45 degrees minimum. Many Pacific Northwest cabins dealing with 140 to 170 inches of annual precipitation pushed toward 60 degrees. This wasn't excess. It was survival engineering. Water doesn't pool on steep surfaces. Snow slides off before accumulating to dangerous weight. And moisture that would rot a shallow pitch roof in 5 years barely touched a steep one. The construction method for steep pitch used purlin roofing horizontal logs notched into progressively shortened gable wall logs. Each successive log at the gable end was cut shorter as the builder worked upward, creating the triangular profile. A flat roof might use only 2 or 3 gable wall logs. A steep roof incorporated as many logs as a full story height, creating pitches approaching or exceeding 45 degrees. The engineering mattered because of weight. A summer-dry sod roof weighed roughly 250 kilograms per square meter, about 51 pounds per square foot. That's already twice the load of wooden shingles. Winter snowpack and moisture saturation increase this to 400–500 kilograms per square meter. On a typical 12 by 14-foot cabin, that's over 3 tons of weight pressing down on the ridgepole and rafters. Under-designed support structures failed catastrophically, usually during spring when melting snow saturated the sod to maximum weight. The historical record documents numerous collapses, families barely escaping as roof structures gave way. The failures shared common characteristics: insufficient pitch allowing snow accumulation, undersized ridgepoles and rafters, poor foundation support that allowed walls to spread under load. Successful builders calculated for this weight from the beginning. They selected old-growth logs for ridgepoles, straight-grain timber 8 to 10 inches in diameter, free of knots and defects. They positioned support posts correctly. They ensured wall logs were large enough to bear the load without compression. And they built steep enough pitch that snow wouldn't accumulate to danger levels in the first place. The materials themselves told their own story. 4 primary roofing systems dominated the frontier, each adapted to regional resources and climate. Hand-split cedar shingles represented the gold standard when materials and time permitted. The process started with log selection. Builders sought straight-grained cedar, pine, or oak old-growth timber that would split cleanly. They cut logs into bolts, 18 to 24 inches long, then used a froe and mallet to split these into individual shingles. The froe was an L-shaped tool, blade 8 to 12 inches long with a perpendicular wooden handle. Technique required driving the blade into the bolt's end grain with a wooden mallet, then twisting the handle to propagate the split. Push down 3 to 6 inches, twist again, and the shingle popped free. An experienced splitter could produce hundreds of rough shingles daily. Cedar earned universal preference for its natural rot resistance. The wood contained oils that repelled moisture, insects, and decay. Western red cedar from the Pacific Northwest proved particularly exceptional trees, 350 to 750 years old, with straight grain and enormous size. But Rocky Mountain builders used whatever cedar, pine, or fir was available, understanding that heartwood from any species vastly outlasted sapwood. The shingles were installed in specific patterns. Starting at the eaves and working upward, builders created a broken bond staggered pattern, shingles overlapping like fish scales. The exposure, the visible portion, measured 1/3 to 1/2 the shingle length. For 24-inch shakes with 10 inches of exposure, this created 3 overlapping layers at every point. Triple protection against water infiltration. The fastening method depended on nail availability. Hand-wrought iron nails were expensive, often costing more than the shingles themselves. When available, builders used 2 nails per shingle, placed 3/4 to 1 inch from edges, and positioned so the course above covered them. This allowed the wood to expand and contract with moisture changes without splitting. Where nails were scarce, traditional Scandinavian weight pole systems provided the alternative. Heavy, debarked logs placed atop overlapping courses, held at proper intervals by notched crosspieces called roof knees, and secured along gable edges with tree root bindings. The weight held everything in place while allowing ventilation. Lower edges of shakes could be pushed aside in fair weather for light and air, a feature trappers valued in seasonal camps. Properly installed cedar shake roofs lasted 30 to 50 years before requiring replacement. The surviving examples from the 1800s that remain standing today used exactly these techniques, testament to their effectiveness. Bark roofing offered faster installation when time was critical. Late-season cabin construction before winter often necessitated speed over longevity. Birch bark earned particular favor in northern regions, bringing with it centuries of Scandinavian expertise. Harvest timing was crucial. Bark peeled cleanly only in summer when sap ran vigorously. A single vertical incision between branches allowed outer bark to separate from the inner bast layer, producing sheets with length equal to tree circumference. The critical detail, removing only outer bark without disturbing the bast layer, allowed trees to survive and continue growing. Fresh bark required immediate storage flat under heavy weights, or it curled into tight rolls impossible to flatten. Installation involved multiple layers, minimum 2, typically 4 to 6, with exceptional structures using up to 16 layers. Each layer went down with the inside bast surface facing upward on rough-hewn roof boards, where friction held it in place without fasteners. Working from eaves toward ridge, builders overlapped each course like shingles, with bark projecting approximately 3 inches at the lower edge, forming a drip line. Extra long sheets straddled the roof ridge. The entire system was secured by heavy wooden poles, interlocked at the peak and bound with tree roots at the gables. Rocks often supplemented the weight poles against wind. Cedar bark from western red cedar in Oregon Territory provided natural rot resistance similar to cedar shakes, but required less processing. Cottonwood bark saw use in marshy areas along river bottoms. The universal principle, multiple overlapping layers. A single layer leaked inevitably. 6 layers created a waterproof membrane. Traditional birch bark roofs lasted approximately 30 years before requiring replacement. Remarkable longevity for material requiring no processing beyond flattening. Sod roofing dominated the treeless prairie where traditional methods were impossible. The Great Plains offered essentially no timber except sparse cottonwood groves along waterways. This transformed construction entirely. What worked in forested mountains failed on open prairie, forcing radical adaptation. The technique drew on both Scandinavian turf roof traditions and observations of Native American earth lodge construction, but it required specific knowledge about materials and engineering. Prairie sod came from unbroken ground with clayey soil and dense fibrous root systems. Buffalo grass, little blue stem, wiregrass, prairie cordgrass, and Indian grass developed root structures far thicker than modern lawn grass, tough enough to hold soil together under tremendous weight. After the mid-1880s invention of the breaking plow, settlers could cut sod into strips 12 to 18 inches wide and 3 to 4 inches thick. Then section these into 2 to 3 foot lengths, called prairie marble. Earlier settlers cut sod laboriously by hand with spades, 1 brick at a time. The work was backbreaking but necessary. Without timber for traditional roofing, sod was survival. The structural requirements demanded robust engineering. That 51 pound per square foot dry weight, increasing to over 100 pounds with winter snow and moisture, required strong cedar ridge poles or sawed lumber rafters with solid wood sheathing. Undersized supports meant collapse. The traditional installation method layered 2 to 6 sheets of birch bark on roof boards first, overlapping from eaves upward to create a waterproof membrane. Sod blocks were placed immediately atop the bark to keep it flat. 2 workers coordinated closely, one laying bark while the other positioned sod before the bark could curl. The first sod layer went grass side down the wilted grass, acting as a drainage layer protecting the bark. Blocks were placed in a staggered brick pattern. The second layer went grass side up, allowing grass to continue growing and eventually permeate the lower layer, creating one solid integrated structure. Total thickness measured 6 to 8 inches. The weight provided benefits. It compressed log walls, making them more draft-proof, and offered excellent insulation against temperature extremes. But the challenges were constant. During rainstorms, water dripped through for days after outside clearing. Families hung canvas tarps inside to catch falling dirt and moisture. Mold, fungus, snakes, mice, and insects inhabited the structure. Most sod roofs required major repairs or complete replacement within 4 to 5 years. Split log or puncheon roofs utilized the heaviest construction. Straight-grained logs 4 to 6 feet long were split using froe and mallet into pieces approximately 1 inch thick and 6 to 8 inches wide. The flat side was hewn smooth using broad axe and adze, while the rounded side remained on the underside. These substantial pieces required robust support structures with strong ridge poles, rafters, and cross stays. Installation involved laying puncheons flat side up on rafters, overlapping to shed water, then securing them with weight poles positioned where pieces overlapped. Extremely steep pitch proved essential. Insufficient slope retained moisture between the heavy logs, causing rot and potential collapse. But materials and pitch were only part of the equation. The third critical element was waterproofing. Pine tar and pitch provided the most effective, readily available treatments. Settlers collected pine or spruce resin, melted it slowly over low fire with extreme caution due to high flammability, strained out wood debris through cheesecloth, and mixed with animal fat for workability. Applied warm, the mixture penetrated wood surfaces and hardened into effective waterproofing. The WWRT-era formula still used by historical preservationists mixed equal parts boiled linseed oil, turpentine, and pine tar. This combination, applied to roof boards before shingling, log end cuts, and gap filling, created water-resistant barriers. Pine resin wasn't water-soluble, providing long-lasting protection. Chimney flashing represented the single most critical waterproofing element. The junction between chimney and roof created the most common leak point, where expanding and contracting materials, temperature differentials, and structural settlement combined to open gaps. Experienced pioneers specifically brought metal flashing in covered wagons, prioritizing this item despite weight limitations. When metal flashing remained unavailable, builders sealed the chimney roof junction with tar, but this required annual reapplication as tar dried, cracked, and failed under temperature cycling. Foundation elevation proved equally critical. The principle that the notches never fail, it's the roof that goes first, then the foundation, emphasized that foundation failure resulted from moisture-related rot rather than structural inadequacy. Experienced builders placed logs on stone foundations, cornerstones minimum. If stone scarce, continuous perimeter stone preferred for full support. This elevated logs above damp soil, allowed air circulation, and prevented moisture wicking from ground into wood. Sill logs, the first course, received special attention. Builders selected the largest, straightest logs and coated them with creosote if any ground contact was unavoidable. Chinking maintenance formed another critical moisture defense. The traditional chinking recipe mixed mud, clay, and sand with water, reinforced with animal hair from hogs, goats, or cows, plus organic materials including corn cobs, corn husks, grass, hemp, and oakum frayed rope. Small sticks or pebbles filled larger gaps before mortar application. This flexible material accommodated seasonal wood expansion and contraction. Logs swelled when wet and shrank when dry, requiring flexible rather than rigid gap filling. Chinking required annual inspection and reapplication every 2 to 3 years in most climates. Gaps over 1/4 inch were sealed immediately to prevent water entry, insect infiltration, and drafts. The regional variations told their own story. Rocky Mountain cabins confronted extreme temperature swings and heavy snowpack. Winters brought prolonged freezing up to 240 days below freezing annually at higher elevations. The region's climate featured pronounced differences between eastern and western slopes, with prevailing westerly winds depositing significantly more moisture on western faces. Mountain builders responded with steep roof pitches specifically designed for rapid snow shedding before dangerous accumulation. The purlin roof construction dominated areas without milled lumber access. Builders created the characteristic triangular gable end by reducing each successive log's length as they built upward. Metal flashing for the chimney roof junction proved so important that pioneers specifically brought it in covered wagons. When metal flashing remained unavailable, builders sealed the junction with pine tar, reapplied annually. Seasonal timing proved critical. Spring through early autumn provided the only viable construction window, with builders racing to achieve weather-tight shell status before first snowfall, typically by September at higher elevations. Cabins oriented facing south for maximum sunlight and warmth, positioned away from prevailing west winds. The Great Plains presented fundamentally different challenges. The prairie ecosystem offered essentially no timber beyond scattered cottonwood groves. This made imported lumber prohibitively expensive. The grassland did provide abundant prairie sod with densely interlocking root structures. Plains climate featured extreme temperature variations with nearly constant wind from multiple directions. Spring brought violent thunderstorms with heavy rainfall, high winds, hail, and tornadoes. Winter delivered sudden Chinook winds that could raise temperatures 30 to 40 degrees within hours, rapidly melting snowpack. Sod construction became the defining plains adaptation. Walls built 2 to 3 sod blocks thick provided both structural strength and thermal insulation. The 3-ton roof weight helped compress log walls when logs could be obtained, reducing drafts and improving insulation. The Pacific Northwest offered the frontier's most abundant timber resources. Ancient temperate rainforests with trees 350 to 750 years old, some reaching 1,000 years and towering 230 to 330 feet. Western red cedar, Douglas fir, western hemlock, Sitka spruce, and Alaska yellow cedar grew in stands containing twice the biomass per acre of tropical rainforests. Pacific Northwest climate created different challenges. Coastal regions received 140 to 170 inches of annual precipitation, 12 to 14 feet, with most falling as persistent rain from October through May. The wet, mild winters and dry, warm summers created less extreme temperature swings, but introduced relentless moisture and humidity. Frontier builders responded with extremely steep roof pitches, 45 to 60-plus degree angles, specifically engineered to shed persistent rain before it could penetrate. Extended eaves of 2 to 3 feet or more provided additional protection, shielding log walls from driving rain and creating covered porches characteristic of Pacific Northwest architecture. Cedar shake roofs, split from the abundant straight-grained timber, covered virtually all permanent structures. The shakes received occasional treatment with linseed oil or pine pitch coatings for additional moisture protection. Construction timing in the Pacific Northwest compressed into a narrow summer window from June through September. Builders faced intense pressure to complete roofing before autumn rains commenced in October. Completing the cedar shake roof before autumn, rains represented an essential survival priority. The expertise gap between builders became most visible during construction. Historical evidence demonstrates that experienced builders completed durable cabins in days, while inexperienced builders struggled for weeks with structures failing within seasons. The record for rapid construction describes 3 men who cut down trees, trimmed them, dragged logs to the building site, notched logs, and built a one-room cabin with chimney and fireplace in 2 days. Benjamin Densmore in 1857 reported completing a cabin body in 1 day with help. Lewis Harrington in 1855 finished his entire cabin in 5 days. In contrast, lone, inexperienced builders typically required 1 to 2 weeks for basic structures, with height limited to 6 to 7 feet by their inability to lift heavy logs overhead without assistance. The critical distinction between temporary cabins and permanent houses centered on construction quality rather than size. Cabins utilized round logs with bark left on, simple saddle notching, dirt floors, minimal or no windows, flat or shallow-pitched roofs, no stone foundations with logs laid directly on ground, and minimal maintenance expectations. These were designed for 1 to 5 year lifespans as temporary shelter. Houses employed hewn logs with all bark and sapwood removed, sophisticated dovetail notching, puncheon floors with split logs laid flat side up, proper cut windows with greased paper or glass, steep-pitched roofs with split shingles, stone foundations elevating logs above damp soil, and regular maintenance schedules. These were built for permanence with century-plus lifespans. The difference was primarily one of size and attention to detail. Most experienced builders preferred flat walls to rounded log walls, and so used hewn logs for building. These not only looked more finished, but also withstood the elements much better, since the bark and the decay-prone outside wood were removed from the logs. Material selection expertise separated experienced from novice builders. Experts cherry-picked the best available logs, old-growth trees with straight grain, few limbs, minimal taper, and consistent diameter. They selected species based on properties: cedar for natural rot resistance, oak for structural strength and durability, pine and fir for availability and straight growth patterns. They recognized that heartwood, the dense inner wood, far outlasted sapwood. Inexperienced builders used the nearest available trees regardless of quality, included knotty and crooked logs, mixed species without consideration for their different properties, and often used sapwood for its easier working characteristics, resulting in premature decay. Notching technique knowledge proved equally important. In high rainfall areas like Washington and Oregon, experienced builders employed single-sided saddle notching with all notches facing downward rather than alternating up and down. This prevented water collection in upward-facing notches that accelerated corner rot. The historical guidance states explicitly, "Don't cut your log-long groove in the bottom log for the next log to fit on top of. Instead, cut your grove in the bottom of the next log before you seat it. This will prevent any accumulation of water, dirt, and debris, as all your grooves are facing downwards." The tool expertise and maintenance separated skilled from unskilled builders. Sharp axes were essential dull axes, not only slowed work, but dramatically increased injury risk through deflection and glancing blows. Froe clubs required rotation with each blow to distribute wear evenly and prevent splitting. Draw knives needed regular sharpening to maintain cutting efficiency. The Frontier toolkit remained remarkably consistent: axes, froes, draw knives, adzes, and augers. Simple hand implements unchanged in principle for centuries, but requiring skill and experience for effective use. Common mistakes by inexperienced builders included insufficient roof pitch, no chimney flashing, logs placed directly on ground, upward-facing notches in wet climates, delayed construction starts, risking incomplete structures before winter, and most critically, failing to maintain structures after initial completion. The first-year assumption that construction was complete when walls stood and roof was on led to neglect of chinking repairs, small leak fixes, debris removal from roofs, and annual waterproofing reapplication. These compounded into major failures within a few seasons. Cultural heritage strongly influenced building success. Finnish and Swedish settlers arriving in the Delaware River region in 1638 brought centuries of refined log construction expertise from forested Scandinavia. Their techniques, horizontal log construction with interlocking corners, sophisticated notching methods, sod and turf roofing with birch bark underlayment, and understanding of moisture management, spread throughout the American frontier as the dominant building paradigm. German and Swiss immigrants brought similar Central European timber framing knowledge. In contrast, settlers from England, Ireland, and Scotland had no log tradition but quickly adopted the technique, facing steep learning curves marked by failures until they mastered the accumulated wisdom that Scandinavian and German builders possessed instinctively. The transition from fur trade to permanent settlement marked a fundamental shift in building philosophy. Mountain men during the 1800 to 1830s fur trade peak prioritized maximum mobility, minimal construction time, adequate rather than comfortable shelter, and no investment in permanence. A typical trapper's tilt measured 10 by 10 to 12 by 12 feet, stood 6 to 8 feet tall, featured bark roofs over simple pole frames, had no windows, employed single hide-covered door openings, and required days to 1 week construction. These were designed for seasonal occupation during trapping runs. Settlement patterns emerging in the 1830s and 1840s brought families seeking year-round residence, agricultural surplus rather than subsistence, and permanence replacing transience. Construction evolved through predictable phases. First season, quick cabins resembling trappers' tilts. First, winter improvements for survival. Second year, proper roofs with split shingles. And following years, adding rooms and better finishes. By the late 1840s, experienced frontier builders had refined roofing techniques into remarkably sophisticated systems, balancing material availability, climate demands, construction time, and longevity. These techniques established regional architectural traditions still evident in Rocky Mountain, Great Plains, and Pacific Northwest building styles today. The ultimate lesson from 1800s to 1840s frontier cabin roofing is that success derived not from available materials, but from accumulated knowledge applied with attention to detail and maintained with consistent effort. The same materials, logs, bark, mud, sod produced structures lasting 2 years or 2 centuries depending on builder expertise. Water management through bark removal, steep pitch, elevation, waterproofing, ventilation, and maintenance proved the single unifying principle behind all successful techniques across every region, every material, and every climate zone of the expanding American frontier. The cabins that still stand today, structures built in the 1800s that survived into the 21st century share common characteristics. All bark and sapwood removed. Steep roof pitch of 45 degrees or more. Stone foundations elevating logs above ground moisture. Evidence of regular pine tar treatment on exposed surfaces. Sophisticated notching that shed water away from joints. And most tellingly, signs of consistent maintenance over decades. These weren't lucky cabins. They were well-engineered cabins built by people who understood that frontier survival wasn't about working harder. It was about working smarter. About learning from those who'd solved these problems generations earlier in different forests across an ocean. About recognizing that published knowledge meant nothing compared to practical experience. And about having the discipline to do maintenance even when it seemed unnecessary. Because by the time rot became visible, the damage was already done. The frontier taught harsh lessons. Cabins built wrong failed within 5 years. Water found every weakness, exploited every shortcut, punished every assumption. But cabins built right with steep pitch, proper drainage, complete bark removal, good foundations, and consistent maintenance. Those cabins became homesteads, then historic landmarks, then testament to what knowledge and precision could accomplish with nothing but hand tools and timber. That's the legacy of frontier roofing. Not the materials, not the location, not even the weather. It was the knowledge. The techniques refined over thousands of years, carried across oceans, adapted to new conditions, and proven through experience. The difference between sleeping dry and rebuilding every 3 years came down to whether you understood what water does to wood and whether you built accordingly. And in the end, that same principle applies to every challenge the frontier presented. Success wasn't about resources. It was about knowledge, precision, and the discipline to do things right, even when shortcuts seemed tempting. The cabins that still stand prove it, not because they were lucky, but because someone, somewhere along the way, understood how to build for centuries instead of seasons.